Brilliant. Thanks, Lizzie. Thank you very much for inviting me teaching house. Very excited to talk about extensive reading. It is my big passion in the LT, so I do apologize if I do seem a little over the top about this subject, but it's something I feel very strongly about, partly because a lot of us aren't doing it. Right, so extensive reading. What is it? What do we think extensive reading is? So for me, there's a lot of different variations of what people think extensive reading is. But I think the main things to establish here is that it's reading a lot of comprehensible materials where the reading's comfortable. And these can be like books that we read for pleasure, but not always. I'll come to that later. But if it's enjoyable, all the better. And it's large quantities of reading. So it could be like books I'm reading right now. I've just finished a Stephen King book. He's not my favorite, but I thought I'd give it a go. I love reading. I'm an avid reader myself. But for students, there's loads of different books they can read. If their levels are high enough, they could read similar books. If not, there's books they can read for their levels, which we'll look at later. But it's about reading a lot and making sure that it just continues and it becomes a habit. And the rewards are huge. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is why we should be doing it and how we get learners involved. Okay, so there's been decades of research on extensive reading. Myself as a researcher, I've been publishing in the last decade or so, but it's been exhaustive, honestly. It's so much stuff out there that's so good. I'm going to be sharing some of my favorites with you. But really, from 4 decades of research, what we can establish now from extensive reading and answer the question as why we should be doing it is because it develops reading comprehension better than anything else. It improves our reading rate and fluency, acquisition of new vocabulary. In fact, a lot of people argue it's the only way we establish large vocabularies, especially to get onto more advanced reading in academic settings and things like that. It also establishes and consolidates partially known vocabulary as well. Improves spelling and writing. It improves and consolidates grammar knowledge. All fluency, so you're speaking, it can help with that. And we'll look at an important study that showed that as well, which was interesting. Raising cultural awareness, knowledge of the world, and even developing empathy traits. There's probably more. This isn't exhaustive, this list. But the results have been conclusive, really, from, like I say, 40, 50 years of research on this subject. So I'm going to give you a little task now. If anyone's as older than me out there, I'm sure there isn't. I'm getting on a bit now. But if there is, does anybody recognize this man in the top right here? If you do, can you drop his name in the chat box? Does anybody know who that man is? Let's see if we can get my chat box open. Nobody aware of who he is?
Raymond Burr has got 2 votes so far. I don't know who he is.
It is Raymond Burr. And he was a famous actor. I think he has passed away now, unfortunately. But he was a famous actor in the sort of 70s, probably late 60s as well, as Ironside. And who else was he? Do you remember, Lizzie? There was someone else that's quite famous. But Ironside was the big one for me. So we've got a picture of Raymond Burr.
Perry Mason.
Perry Mason, that was it.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Jan.
Yeah. So we've got Raymond Burr, we've got a tropical island and a whole load of books. What I'd like you to do is see if you can make the connection between these 3 images. What do you think these have in common to make a story? And just wondering if we could get some feedback in the chat box. Just anything you think it might be. What's the connection between Raymond Burr, a nice island, and a load of books?
Leno.
You probably did enjoy reading at the beach.
Yeah.
A bit about desert island reading.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Went to the beach to write a book. Ooh.
Yeah, as I say, the connection between the books and the picture of him in court is that you need to read a lot of books to get education to be a lawyer or a police officer. He
Oh,
did both. He was a lawyer and a police officer in his
interesting.
movies. And if you are a lawyer, you do well in your career, you have money to have vacations at the beach.
Very good, very good. Well, there's actually a sort of really interesting story here, is that Raymond Burr, he actually made a lot of money from his success, and he bought one of the Fijian islands, and where he sort of, I think he might have retired there. And on that Fijian island, he donated a lot of his books to one of the local schools. And what they noticed over the next year or two was something quite dramatic. The exam results were starting to go through the roof, and compared to what they'd been before. And the only difference was now these kids were reading and reading a lot. And although this was just anecdotal, it was picked up by some other researchers, Ellie and Mangabai, if I'm pronouncing their names correctly, and it started the book flood studies. Now they went to Fiji, and look, seems a nice place to do some research. And unlike mine, which has mostly been in Lincoln and Nottingham, which are lovely places, but Fiji sounds a bit nicer. But they did their research based on what they'd, I'm pretty sure it was based on what they'd come across from Raymond Burr, if I'm not mistaken. And they'd come across that story. And they basically picked 12 schools. They selected 8 for the intervention, and they had 4 control groups. That meant that 8 of these schools were going to be reading, and they were going to be reading for half an hour every day. Now, the important thing is they weren't doing that in addition. They were doing that as part of their education sort of hours of each day. So all the schools got the same amount of tuition a day, just half an hour of theirs was based on reading. So what they found with these schools was at the end of year 1, the growth in reading was twice that of the control groups. So it just showed how much extensive reading really sort of does promote sort of reading fluency and, well, basically sort of proper reading. And at the end of year 2, the gains had increased substantially in all modes of English tested, not just reading. So we're talking about grammar, vocabulary, everything had substantially increased. It also spread to other subjects. They noticed that the reading groups were also performing better in subjects like science and maths as well. So there was things happening, and there are sort of research out there that have showed that reading actually physically shapes the brain. There's a lot of things that actually does to the brain. I'm not going to get into that in this talk, but it really has big impacts on the brain per se, not just for actually increasing reading ability. But the pass rate in the English exam, and this is what's probably most of interest to most teachers and school owners, is that the pass rate in the English exam was twice that of the control groups. And that was just by reading. That was the only difference they were doing. So these were like the start of the book flood studies. There's been lots of studies since then that have also been called book flood studies, where they've flooded sort of schools with books and seen the impacts of it. And I'm just going to address one more. Now, this is my favorite study out there. It's one that's kind of floated under the radar a little bit. It's not talked about an awful lot, but it was absolutely incredible. And you may have heard of Patsy Lightbound. She did a great book. I think it was called How Languages Are Learned or something similar to that. She's very well known in that sort of circuit, but not so much as a reading researcher. There are some of her colleagues that are more sort of familiar with reading research, like Marlisa Horst, I think, was involved in this study. But it was a great study, and it took place in Canada. And what happened was that there was too many students for the school. They didn't have enough students, enough teachers for all these students. And I think it was like 100 or probably more than that they had to do something with. So what they did, they created a language lab. This was for English classes. So these students, they had no teacher, but what they did have was access to books. And they would be reading for 30 minutes every day. They also had cassettes. They could listen while they read as well. But all they were doing was reading every day. They had no interaction with a teacher whatsoever. Now, that's the important thing here. While the other students that were having regular classes, it was kind of typical audiolingual style of classes, were getting 30 minutes of regular classes every day. These students had nothing other than books and audio cassettes. What they found after 2 years was that this reading group performed as well, if not better, on most measures, including speaking. So their speaking was still just as good, even though they didn't have a teacher to interact with, compared to the control groups. And then after 6 years, they measured them again. They've been doing this for 6 years now with no teacher. They performed as well as the control groups in just about everything. Speaking was also still very, very good. The only thing that had dipped below the control groups was writing. And for me, this was just outstanding, you know, to think this is the power of just reading. This is what can be achieved just by reading alone. And it's something that we neglect so much in schools all over the world. Yet it's so powerful. And there's so much evidence to support the benefits that you get from just reading. A few people have kind of criticized the paper a little bit, this one, saying, oh, well, you know, are we saying we don't need teachers anymore? But I don't think that's what they're saying at all with this paper. But imagine what they could do if they had a teacher as well. You know, so for me, it's like if we have the reading and we have all these benefits and we have the benefit of a teacher as well, imagine what they could achieve then. Maybe we could ask Patsy to go back and do this again and spend another 6 years with a teacher this time. Great. The other studies that I just want to highlight are the Clockwork Orange studies. And these were really sort of made famous because of the vocabulary developments of reading, which is what reading's really sort of probably most known for in terms of its payoff, is the amount of vocabulary that can get acquired through no explicit attention. So it's like incidental learning. And yeah, the first study that was actually done on the book Clockwork Orange was by Suragi et al. And Paul Nation, who's really renowned. In fact, just read anything by Paul Nation. I'm a huge fan of Paul Nation, or watch any videos by Paul Nation. He's one of the leading vocabulary researchers in the world, probably the most prolific, I would say. I'd be surprised if anyone's written more than Paul Nation on vocabulary, but he's very interested in reading and extensive reading. And I'm pretty sure he was involved in that first study in '78. And what they did, they got 20 native speakers to read A Clockwork Orange. They didn't tell them what they were going to test them on. But this book contains 90 nadsat words. Now, these are like Russian slang. There's no dictionary you can use to look up these words or anything like that. And they didn't know they were going to be tested on anything like that. But when the native speakers had finished reading the book, they were tested on these nadsat words. Now, extraordinarily, they managed to learn 75% of them. That was the uptake rate just from reading. There was no way they could look them up. They couldn't use dictionaries. This was just by seeing the words repeated through the text and using the context to figure out the meaning. So that was quite astonishing. And that led to a lot of other studies based on a similar thing, others with Clockwork Orange itself, with lower level learners with less, you know, results because you don't have enough of the context to figure out the meaning. But another good one that was a similar book was Things Fall Apart. And this was Pelitha Sanchez and Norbert Schmidt. Again, Norbert is another big vocabularist who's written an awful lot of papers. I know Norbert quite well. Yeah, he is also interested in extensive reading. And this book has a lot of African slang words in there. And similar thing, but this was with advanced second language learners who read the book, and afterwards they tested them on the African slang words, and they had a 65% uptake, which was like an incredible amount of words, really. So yeah, and in fact, the kind of relationship between learning new words and reading, developing sort of the more words you know, the more you can comprehend the text. And that sort of growth and sort of comprehension is reciprocal. The more words you know, the more you comprehend. The more you comprehend, the more opportunities for learning new words in context. And it keeps sort of building and building. And that's how we can acquire large vocabularies. Okay, so there's some of my favorite research papers. And really, there's so much research that I could have, you know, if I had more time today, I'd love to go through with you. But really, two of the key people in extensive reading are Rob Waring, who is, I think he pretty much runs the Extensive Reading Foundation now, and Bill Grabe, who's written some great books on reading. Really check those guys out for sure. Rob Waring, he says that basically extensive reading is more effective at acquiring language than course books. He's quite passionate about that. And Bill Grabe really sort of in his 2009 book, I think it's just been revised actually, this book. I think there's one that's just come out. I can't remember what it's called. I've got a handout to post in the chat later. It's got it there. I think it's Reading in a Second Language, it's called, by Cambridge University Press. But Bill Grabe's book is amazing. And he basically did a review of 4 decades of research and was just questioning, why isn't everyone doing this? You know, it's so powerful, it's such a good tool. And, you know, and really in terms of effort from teachers, and maybe this is one thing that puts teachers off, we don't have to do very much. The learners are doing the work, they're doing all the reading, there's very little prep in terms of like actually setting the reading up. So yeah, why isn't everyone doing it? So I noticed that Lizzie's just dropped a nice little link to my book that I wrote recently in the chat box, which thank you very much. This is it. So basically me and Sue Leather got together, and because we've been talking about extensive reading for years, we've been doing talks all over the world, you know, on this subject. I think my first one was about 15, 16 years ago. And it still, to me, doesn't feel like we've got any further. It still often finds itself as the road less traveled. A lot of schools don't really get involved in extensive reading. A lot of students don't know about it. A lot of trainees on CELTA courses and things have no idea about it. It's not something that's promoted on CELTA courses very often because we're too busy pushing intensive reading, which is great, but it's not everything. So, you know, it doesn't get talked about an awful lot, yet it should. So we were thinking about, you know, what is it that's missing? There's a lot of talks going on. There'll be, you know, IATEFL, there'll be talks on extensive reading for sure. For me, what I found was that they tend to be very similar, and including my own. I was finding after 15 years, I'm still saying the same things. I'm sort of just talking about what it is and how we, you know, should do it. So what's missing? And what we thought was really it's about motivation. And you know, how do we motivate not just learners but teachers to really sort of get involved and understand, you know, why extensive reading is important and how we can sort of really encourage learners to get involved. And the payoffs are huge, but it does take time. That's probably one thing that puts people off. So we wrote the book, and the book basically focused on beliefs, values, and goals. And these are 3 key motivational things of motivational theory. I'm not going to go into the details of all the theories and everything. They're sort of quite deeply discussed in the book, but I wanted to keep this talk a little bit lighter today. But I will be touching on all 3 of these areas. And a lot of the talks that I've done over the years are mostly focused on beliefs. You know, how do we encourage learner beliefs that they can actually read successfully, and how do we create successful reading opportunities? But I'm going to go much further than that in this talk. So here goes. So when we're talking about learner beliefs, we're really asking, can I do this task? So learners, if they're faced with reading, they're saying, can I read this book? Am I able to finish this book? Now, if we're to be giving like average learners in schools Shakespeare, then the answer is probably no. So we need to be careful of the sort of books that we give learners, so we're allowing successful reading opportunities for them. The number one thing is making sure the materials are comprehensible. And that means that it needs to be very, very few unknown words in the text. I'm going to get to specifics in just a moment, but the reading should be easy. It should be comfortable. Now, that might sound strange. You might think, well, Jez, if it's too easy, what's the point? Well, the point is they're going to develop this reading fluency by seeing known words over and over, and that develops automaticity, which is that instant recognition of words. So they're gliding over pages, and that allows you to connect ideas from page to page, from chapter to chapter, rather than just getting from the top to the bottom and struggling through it. And by the time you've got to the bottom, you've forgotten what was at the top. So it's about connecting ideas and getting that fluent reading, and all those other benefits and gains come while you're reading. And if it's enjoyable as well, well, that's just a big bonus too, isn't it? So making sure that the materials are comprehensible is rule number 1. Number 2 is providing lots of choice. Learners having choice over what they read is very motivational. If they don't have choice, then they might sort of be stifled and straitjacketed into something that a teacher thinks is good, but it might not necessarily be what the learners think is good. So the more choice, the better. And there's lots of choice out there for all levels of learners, which I'm going to touch on later. And making sure that there's lots of plenty of interesting materials to read. Okay, so here's the bit that might come as a shock. It usually shocks a lot of people when I come out with this at talks. And it's the thing I get asked about the most, really, is about how much how many words do learners need to know in order to comprehend the books? Now, what we do know from all the research is the more words known, the greater the comprehension. It's a real linear relationship between words known and comprehension. Okay, so all the studies, all of them, I can't think of any that sort of show the opposite, have had that linear progression. Once the learners know more words in the text, they're going to get greater comprehension. In order to read, with adequate comprehension, then what we say is that they need to know at least 98% of the words in the text. Now, that sounds a huge amount, I know, but to put that in context, that's about 6 unknown words on a 300-word page, something like that. Some can read with less if they're bringing other things to the table, like a lot of background knowledge. There's other things that aid reading comprehension for sure. I'm not saying it's only vocabulary, but vocabulary knowledge is the key one, really, in terms of like reading comprehension. So, for example, Batia Laufer came up with this threshold system where she said 95% is kind of a kind of adequate sort of threshold. That might be enough for some, but 98% it seems the optimal threshold. I've done studies on this as well, and I've found that learners with 98% and above have really great comprehension scores. When it goes down to 95, it might be okay, but it's not as strong. So really, when we're thinking about that deeper understanding, they need to have a very, very good knowledge of the words within the text. Graded readers. I'm going to come to those in a moment, but graded readers, all the major publishers have graded readers, Cambridge, Oxford, Macmillan, the lot. They're freely available, well, they're not free, but they're very available everywhere. Online as well, there's plenty of places where you can find graded readers online. And they're fantastic. They used to get a bit of a bad press for being poorly written, but they've come an awful long way in recent times. Even my mum loves reading them now. And, and in fact, I'm going to talk about book clubs later, but an interesting thing was that when I used to do these quite often, there was a group of girls that became Sue Leather fans. They loved her books that she wrote and started looking out for more books by Sue Leather. So they have come a long way. They're well written. They're great books to read. There's not just fiction. There's lots of fact-based books with National Geographic and things. There's so much stuff out there. It's really quite an amazing, an exciting time for extensive reading. And what graded readers do is they allow for successful reading. And when learners experience success with reading, they're going to want to read more. It's quite a motivational sort of feeling, that feeling of success. So here's just a snippet about extensive of graded readers, sorry. So in the top middle, you can see some of the National Geographic ones. I think the ones on the right are from Oxford Bookworms. And on the left, some of the Cambridge. In fact, there's a little bit of one of Sue Leather's books just there, Death in the Dojo, which is a great book. And yeah, there's just so much choice. And what they do more than anything is they remove barriers to comprehension, and they allow for successful, enjoyable reading at all levels. So even lower level learners can access reading and read for a lot of pleasure and have a lot of fun with it. So yeah, it's not just restricted to higher level learners who have like large vocabularies. Graded readers start very low, where learners with very small vocabularies can actually access these books and start reading. And the first one might be a bit tricky, but the more they read at that level, the more they develop the fluency because they're seeing the same words over and over and getting more engaged in the process of reading itself. They're available in both digital and paperback formats. I don't want to get into the big digital versus paper debate today if I can help it. It's quite a big subject in itself. I do have some stuff right at the end if there's time, but that's still undergoing a lot of research at the moment. But I don't want to sort of get into that now. And then the other thing about graded readers is they do, I believe, provide a smooth transition to reading unsimplified literature. So, if learners go on a graded reading course and they go through all the levels of the published materials, then can they make the jump to read literature that native speakers would read? Well, I did a study with Norbert and Diane Schmidt. Oh, wow, that's 10 years ago. I'm feeling quite old now. That was a case study. It was 4 people. But what we realized was that, yes, their comprehension levels went down a little bit because their vocabulary sort of knowledge and coverage went down from over 99% to about 95%. But they all read comfortably, with no problems, and enjoyed it just as much. And to be honest, once they get to that sort of level, you find most readers, once they've got the bug, probably want to wean themselves off graded readers anyway. But yeah, check out that study. It's freely available on Reading as a Foreign Language Journal. So you should be able to find that easy enough. Great. Right. So we talked about what extensive reading is. We've talked about the types of books learners need for successful reading opportunities, and how we encourage learner beliefs so they can sort of get successful opportunities for reading. But, having all the belief in the world still doesn't mean you're going to do it. It's like, if we look at the picture here, skydiving. I mean, you could give me all the best skydiving gear in the world. You could give me a nice fancy helmet and a lovely looking parachute. I'm still not going to do it. Not a chance. So here's the thing. How do we get learners to want to do reading and engage in it? It's the $6 million question. Now, when I started doing the research for the book that me and Sue Leather published, this was one of the most exciting parts of it for me, really, because it was so eye-opening for me, someone who had been involved in extensive reading for many, many years. And suddenly I'm looking at this thinking, oh, I haven't been looking at this at all. So we're going to look at values. And what do I mean by values? Well, Eccles, who has done an awful lot in first language research on motivation, she really focuses on these 4 core values for attainment value, utility value, cost, and interest. Now, attainment value is one of the most interesting things that I kind of was aware of, but hadn't really considered in terms of how I kind of help my learners get involved in extensive reading. When we talk about attainment value, skydiving is very different, Chris, you're right. It is. When we talk about attainment value, we're talking about our identity. Do I look cool with this book? Is this something I want to be associated with? There was a lot of studies years ago, so looking at what kinds of books boys like versus girls and stuff. I'm not sure it's so sort of distinct these days, but I seem to sort of read more things that girls were associated with in that case. But here's a book, Lola Largo. Now, I was running one of the international house schools in Spain for a number of years. And my Spanish was terrible at the time, but as a director, I felt it quite important that I should be learning Spanish. So part of that was doing extensive reading. And they had these books called Lola Largo in the school. And so I started reading them. But as you can see, they kind of look a little bit sort of teenagery, maybe even younger. And so when I was finding myself reading these books in the local cafe, I did feel a little self-conscious. And so my wife suggested at the time, why don't you just put it in another cover? So I had, I think, Where the Crawdads Sing sort of wrapped around Lola Largo as I'm reading it in the cafe, because I felt self-conscious. And it is a real thing, we have to feel good about what we're doing. And so this is one thing to consider. Another thing that really impacts on attainment value and on our sense of self is past failures. So if we've had learners who have consistently not performed well with extensive reading or reading in general, they might not want to do it because of that. So we need to give them more successful opportunities by reading at the right levels and building that confidence back up again. So in terms of attainment value, what do you think our role as a teacher should be? What kind of things do you think we could do to help people feel better about reading and more comfortable with it? Model? Yeah, absolutely. We should be role models. Is that what you mean, Chris? Because I absolutely agree. Yeah, 100%. Good. We getting any more sort of thoughts coming through? Well, I agree with that. I think first we need to be a role model as a teacher. Start with 100% comprehension. Yeah, very good. But yeah, creating positive classroom cultures here for reading, making reading part of the classroom culture. Yeah, and a culture that values and encourages reading. And like Chris has said in the chat there, there was a lot coming through now. Is audio okay? Okay, so I'll come back to that in just a second. But yeah, the main thing is creating that classroom culture. So we've actually got that classroom feel where everyone feels comfortable reading. And if everyone's reading, no one's going to feel out of place reading. Book clubs, great. Good, good, good. Yeah, so audio. If you're listening to the audio for the graded readers, then you're actually promoting extensive listening, which is also very, very valuable, very good, and something we also don't do a lot of, mostly. But yeah, sometimes listening and reading at the same time can be helpful. Yeah, for sure. And yes, very few teachers like reading as well. That's absolutely true. And that's another part of the problem, why extensive reading probably hasn't caught fire in a lot of institutions. Okay, great. So onto utility value. So one thing that's kind of not bugged me so much, but a lot of talks you'll see people talking about extensive reading and reading for pleasure as if they're synonymous. And in fact, it's often just called reading for pleasure, but they're not the same. Now, hopefully reading can be pleasurable and is for the most part, but I love this quote by Green and his colleagues, where they said, engaging in reading is far from a meaningless leisure activity that ends when one closes the cover of a book. Okay, there's just so much more that comes with it. And, you know, as we've talked about, the benefits that come from reading, you know, picking up, acquiring vocabulary and things like that, there's so much that comes from reading. Sorry, someone? Nope. Okay, sorry, I thought it was a question. But there's so many benefits to reading that, you know, why aren't we sort of discussing these with learners? So when we're talking about utility value, it's kind of like we know there's going to be a payoff for this. So when I'm reading Lola Largo, okay, the stories were okay, but I was doing it because I knew it was going to help with my Spanish. It was going to consolidate grammar knowledge that I've been sort of learning at that level. It was going to help with new vocabulary, and it did. So I was reading knowing it had some utility value because it was going to pay off in terms of my linguistic development. So here's our next question. As a teacher, how can we promote utility value? What should we be doing here? Sorry, Mohammed. Yeah, so in terms of promoting utility value, what should we be doing there as a teacher? How can we get learners to sort of buy into the value of reading? Okay, so one way, and if you get the book, I've got a few things in the book in terms of activities that can be used as jigsaw reading tasks with learners. So I've broken down some of the key studies, and I've got other sort of things. So there's the benefits of reading in terms of like impacting other subjects and on reading ability, on vocabulary development. There's all these different things where you can actually turn them into jigsaw reading tasks and then get the learners discussing what they've just read about. That generally works quite well. As a director of schools, I've encouraged extensive reading in the class, but also out of the classroom, and brought things up in parents' meetings. So I'm talking to parents quite a lot, so they're sure of how to encourage their children to keep reading. Teacher training courses. I think we teacher trainers need to do more to promote it there as well. It doesn't get much of a shout out, certainly on many CELTA courses. So I think, I do an input session on mine where for the reading where I do actually touch on extensive reading as well, just so learners know the difference, or trainees, sorry, between intensive and extensive reading. That's one thing there. Okay. Cost. This is probably the most under-researched part of motivation out there. It's had very little attention, but it's probably one of the biggest reasons why extensive reading hasn't taken off in a lot of places. And there's Day and Bamford, and that's a critical book to get if you're interested in extensive reading, really. It's a great starter point. Their book that they wrote in 1998. Finding time for extensive reading is a matter of priorities. And in terms of like cost, it's like if we're going to invest the time in reading, then we're likely going to have to give something else up to make time for it. That's the thing. So it's how important is it? So if we push the utility value, maybe we can make it more of a priority. But it is that. And for teachers, it can be a difficult one, especially when they're in schools with high stakes tests and thinking, yeah, I haven't got time for this, especially when it's been sort of touted as being reading for pleasure. It gets that kind of idea that it's just something for fun that doesn't really, matter that much, doesn't have such a big impact on learning. It's just a fun little thing, a fun little extra, when that couldn't be further from the truth. So I think for a lot of teachers who have to train teachers for high stakes tests and things, and there's that pressure on, giving them test practice after test practice, teachers might feel there isn't time for this in the schedule, but it's something that can be done outside of the class and kind of brought in sort of smaller doses rather than most of the reading taking part in the classes. But yeah, so that's one of the things there. So again, it's all about increasing the utility value so it gets valued more in terms of what can be achieved through reading and reading a lot. Not just through the students, but through all stakeholders that are involved. I think it needs a lot of people to sort of really buy into this for it to be successful. And even, some people argue extensive reading should be made part of school curriculums and academy curriculums and things, just to really sort of give it the best chance of success. And then the last thing, really, in terms of the values, is interest. And it comes as no surprise, the more interested you are in doing something, the more likely you are to do it. Interest in reading results in a higher quantity of reading and higher reading achievement. No surprises there. Not all learners enjoy reading. And somebody mentioned earlier, not all teachers enjoy reading. But here's the thing, interest can be developed. And in fact, one thing that really stood out to me in the research for this book was the work of Heidi, H-I-D-I. I'll just drop this in the chat box, actually. I don't think I've, oh, yeah. Oops, no. It keeps defaulting the spelling, sorry. Yeah, Heidi and her colleagues have done an awful lot on interest and interest development, how to develop it. It's quite interesting. Again, it's too sort of much for this talk, but interest can be developed, and our role is to create and maintain interest in reading, and it can be done in various ways. And there's lots of talks out there on extensive reading that sort of talk about this. Prediction task, book blurbs, use the book blurbs on the back to get some initial interest. Ask the learners what they actually like reading would be a nice start as well, create some interest inventories. But one thing that really took off in the United States, and this was with Guthrie and his colleagues, was this idea of CORI, which is concept-oriented reading instruction. And yeah, thanks, Chris. And so this is a bit more of a process to this, where it involves hands-on activities. So they have students day after day in these schools. It's not the same as most academies where we might only see them once or twice a week. But, if you can tap into this and do something with it, great. But they might start with something like performing a reenactment of early explorers to get learners interested in that sort of thing. And then when the learners develop questions about this, their own questions about early explorers, those questions generated from the learners become conceptual knowledge goals. That means they've set their own goals now. They need to find answers to these questions. So then the next thing is that the teachers provide lots of books. So these are non-fiction, where learners can read and read and read and find the answers to their questions. And so they've got invested in this. They've now got a reason to read. And this also pays off quite well in the AP courses, English for academic purposes, and universities and things, which has been, used in this way. where you're actually getting learners to generate questions and then go off and read and sort of bring that back to the academic sort of writing part of the course. But yeah, they have to go away, read widely to find their answers, and through collaborative tasks, project sort of work where learners are working together to find, share ideas for each other's answers and things, that maintains the interest and keeps it going. One thing that I did, and something I've seen a few people sort of mention in the chat, is book clubs. And this is really what sort of got me doing talks on reading. Just 1 second, sorry. My mouth's drying up. So this was a long, long time ago. I did these book clubs, and this was in Lincoln. It would have been about 15 years ago now, I think. And yeah, so basically we had a lot of migrants, Polish and Lithuanian migrants that came across, and they just didn't get enough in terms of education for English. It was like 1 evening a week or something, and they needed more. And so I set up the book clubs just to give them something else. But a lot more happened on the back of this than I kind of thought would happen, and in terms of the social aspect and stuff. And I've got this quote by Jeremy Harmer. I can't remember where that was, where that conversation took place or what it's from or anything, but it happened somewhere. And I quite liked it because he summarized what was going on quite nicely and succinctly. That it's sort of book clubs, they create that socialization, a lot of conversation and purposeful language learning. And even little things like the photo in the bottom right, that was a low-level group of language learners. And yet they're producing really nice grammatical structures by talking about the books, starting with present perfect structures like I've just read, would roll off the tongue from the lowest level learner in that group, because they're so used to that being the norm, and it becomes high frequency in those sort of discussions. I've just read this book. I've just read whatever. I've just finished. And it was great. You see all these things that they wouldn't be learning for another year or so, and especially if they're only having 1 class a week. And I could see language sort of growing on the back of it. So it was almost like task-based learning in a way, probably in its purest form, if you think about it. Like the reading is just the task, and then the language input comes afterwards during the discussions and things. But yeah, it was absolutely fantastic seeing these in action. And the other thing that happened with these book clubs is that reading started becoming caught. So they say that reading is caught, not taught. And a lot of the learners that I had in my groups at the time, actually at the college that I was working at back then, there was a lot of reluctant readers, people who didn't like reading and all the rest of it. But these learners would come back to the class and they'd be talking about it. And then suddenly the others would start saying, can I come? Can I come? Can I have a book? Can I have a book? And it just spread until I got the whole lot reading. And then the next year when I did this, everybody was in right from the start. And when we go back to cost, the notion of cost, which, because the books can be quite expensive, it can often be cheaper doing it online, signing up to sort of M-Reader or X-Reader or those sort of things, which I'll touch on in a bit. I got every learner in my class to buy one book each, a different book. So with a class of 20 learners, I suddenly had a library of 20 books for the price of one. And then they just read and swap, read and swap, read and swap. And then they do it again. And 20 books is at least 20 weeks worth of reading. So you do that twice, you've almost got a year's worth of reading materials. And it's cost the learner probably 10 quid, I think it was back then, something like that. So that was a cost efficient way of doing it. But no, Chris, I didn't have them reading the same books. They all read different books, and it works just fine. And in fact, it often works better that way. And in fact, in the book clubs, I had people at different levels. So I had people reading level 5 books and level 1 books, all in the same thing. And it was so supportive. It really worked, quite well. So yeah, book clubs were great. And on the back of this, there's a girl in the top left-hand corner called Aurelia. And she, actually, I did a talk for the British Council quite a long time ago now, I think, where I mentioned her journey with extensive reading. When she started, she was reading the level 3 Cambridge readers. And she wanted to read like normal, unsort of simplified novels. but couldn't. So she started at the level 3 and worked her way up. And then she ended up being part of one of my studies that I did, making the jump to unsimplified literature. And she did very well. And then she got a job as English as an additional language tutor, support tutor in one of the local secondary schools. And she introduced the book clubs there for the EAL students. And it caught like wildfire. And then on the back of that, that school became famous for this. Another one of the secondary schools in Lincoln then started doing it as well. And this was all off the back of someone in my book club that had gone to a school, set up these book clubs, and just flown with it. So it just shows what can be achieved through these things. It was quite amazing, really. Okay, and this is a typical thing that we do. I'm probably going to be in trouble because I can't remember what book this is from, so I haven't got a reference for it. But I've just used it in a previous talk, but I just couldn't find the reference. But this is the start of an Oxford Bookworm book. I'm pretty sure it's true crime stories or real crime stories, something like that. And you could start with just the headline. I want you to teach me how to shoot a gun, Susan Carpenter said to her husband at breakfast. Okay, just put that on the board. So why do you think Susan wants to learn to shoot a gun? Any answers in the chat box? What do you think? She had a bad dream? Yeah, maybe. Is that it? Come on, let's get some more answers because I need a break.
We're living in
from her husband. Oh,
living in
she wants to
dangerous
defend herself, to shoot him. She wants to get rid of him. Problems with the neighbors, go hunting, self-defense. Good, 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 good. Right. So now. Sorry, I think I muted myself. Am I muted? You can hear me.
Sorry, I muted you by accident, Jez.
How dare
Sorry
you?
about
That's all right. Yep. No, great. Some really nice answers there, but I'm actually a bit worried about you all now. Terrific. Yeah, so you see how that encourages people. So learners can sort of put their answers forward, and now they want to read it. They want to find out, just like any other prediction task, really. You're going to hate me now because I can't actually remember what the reason was. I'll try and remember by the end. Oh, that was right. I think she actually, I don't know, do you want to actually read the Oxford Bookworm, or shall I just give you the answer? No, I don't think anyone's going to read the book. I think it was she got mugged and wanted to self-protect herself in the street. But then I think the twist at the end of the book was she became a mugger. So yeah, it's quite funny. I'll try and remember the title, Chris, by the end of the thing. I'll have to find it and dig it out somewhere. Good. Okay, so now we've got the beliefs, we've got the values, we've got the interest. Now, why am I going to do it? Okay, so the goals. Goal setting is really, really important for motivation. It's a real motivational tool when learners set their own goals to read. Specific goals are more likely to encourage learners to self-evaluate their progress. Excuse me, the proximal short-term goals, where they can see, this is the thing. So extensive reading, learners often don't see the benefits quickly, as you would with a grammar point, let's say. You know, if they're learning a very, you know, something about a tense or something that they didn't quite know, it's very easy to see learning take place by the end of the lesson. But in the case of extensive reading, it's harder to track that progress. And so, you know, goals are really good ways of doing that. So learners have got that sort of challenge to sort of, you know, see that they're kind of ticking the boxes and moving forward. So short-term goals result in greater motivation. And a good tip is to start small, think big, you know, so I want to read 3 books a month. That would be probably quite ambitious. So let's say, well, try 1 first. And then, you know, if you can build it up to 3 or 4 over a period of time, great. Let's see how you go for starters. Book targets are the probably simplest and easiest to measure as in terms of goals. The recommendation, I think, from Paul Nation, I think it was, who said a book every week or 2 is probably good enough. Word targets are another one that comes up quite a lot in research. 200,000 words a year sounds an awful lot, doesn't it? It's not that much. You know, a lot of the level 6 books for like Cambridge have about 25,000 words. So they're quite big, and they start at about 2,000 or 3,000, I think, in the lower level books. So they are in the thousands. And so I think it's quite useful to use word targets as goals. And this has been shown to be effective both online reading and paper reading, you know, in terms of like the studies so far. Content goals, there are other ones. That'd be more for sort of non-fiction, really. You probably could do it for fiction books, but it lends itself very well to kind of non-fiction, where learners have to actually kind of answer questions that they've kind of come up with based on a subject. And I can't remember who the authors were now for the study, but it was a really nice EAP study that came out not that long ago, where they'd used this kind of approach, where learners set their questions. They had all the reading materials about green waste and something like that. But it was a really nice EAP program where extensive reading had been blended into that program. Learners had their questions, they had to go and read to find their answers and then put their papers together. So content goals can also work very well as well. Okay, so how do we bring this all together? Self-regulation. So this is one of the things where we don't often get involved an awful lot, and perhaps we should do. So we do have a role as a teacher, like we mentioned earlier. I think Chris mentioned it as well in the chat. We should be role models. We need to be role models for the learners, because learners will build trust in us as teachers, and things that we buy into, hopefully they'll buy into too. And if we sort of show that reading is good and that we love it too, hopefully that will sort of, you know, rub off on the learners too. But we need to help them become skilled at the following things. They need to be able to set realistic and achievable goals, you know, not too high, not too low. They need to be able to find a good time to read, a good place to read, minimizing distractions. It sounds easy, but often it's not, and they need help with this. And this is something that's actually got a fancy term of environmental structuring. I think it was Zimmerman who sort of did all the research on this stuff. But how learners kind of that become more aware of their own self-efficacy and their own sort of skills as a learner are better at structuring their own environments to create better learning opportunities. So it could be that you know, if learners say, "Oh, I didn't have time to do it last night," because they, you know, the only time they chose to read a book was when their favorite movie was on or something. Well, let's look at that. Maybe you could have done it the day after or the day before, and trying to find that sort of timetable that works for learners and work with them with this kind of thing. Get them to minimize distractions. What it actually is a useful activity to do in the classroom. What kind of things can you do at home to minimize distractions? You know, in terms of like making sure you've got a nice quiet environment. You've got nice little plate of biscuits and a cup of tea, and you'll treat yourself to a biscuit if you get to the end of the first chapter, you know, those sort of little things. Creating that nice environment, so they actually think, right, now this is something I want to do, and I'm going to settle down into it. I've locked my bedroom door, you know, turn the mobile phone off, etc., etc. Okay, so as teachers, we need to help them with this. We need to help them set realistic goals. One good way of doing this is start by setting upper and lower limits. Say, like, you can't go above this, you can't go below that. So where do you want to be setting your goals in between that sort of framework? You can start learner contracts with them, where they have to sort of sign that they've agreed to do this and read this by this time. But another thing that is really handy, although it can be time consuming, actually having goal conferences with learners. So there's a guy called G-A-A, back in the 70s that was talking about this an awful lot and did a lot of research on learner conferences and found them to be super positive when the feedback was positive. So when we're giving feedback to learners, it needs to be encouraging. And so we're not sort of like, lambasting them for not having achieved a goal. It's like, well, let's look at why you didn't, and let's try and make this better next time. What needs fixing? What do we need to change? And sort of help learners reflect positively and constructively on areas that need improving to improve future efforts. So in terms of like giving motivational feedback, let's say a learner says, I didn't manage to read a chapter as planned, there were too many difficult words. What kind of positive feedback can we give there? Not, oh, you need to try harder. Any ideas? We can put some answers in the chat box. Great. Yep. So the book level is probably too high. So just try an easier book. It's fine. And there shouldn't be any, exactly. So the level's clearly not right there. I got too distracted as my favorite TV show was on. I only managed to read one chapter instead of 3. What could we say back there? How could we feedback? Oh, good, Lizzie. Yeah, one chapter is great. Well done. It's still good to encourage the chapter that was read. Yeah. Good. Throw away your TV. Yeah. So find a better time for reading that prevents fewer distractions. And this is something we can go through with them in a classroom. But also, the ones that are managing to achieve it, ask them what they're doing. How are they managing their time? What are they doing that the others aren't? You know, to sort of get ideas there. Read on the loo, absolutely, yeah. 6 chapters was far too much. I could only read 3 chapters in 30 minutes. Yeah, is that a realistic target? Exactly. So yeah, often learners want to, you know, they set the goals too high to start with, and we just need to make sure that we're getting those goals that are comfortable to achieve and manageable. Yeah, absolutely. Right, so this is the last part. So what we did in our book, we came up with a motivational reading cycle, very much based on Dornier's motivational cycle, but just tweaked to sort of suit the reading purposes. And so, yeah, this cycle is something that we hope will take off. And we really strongly believe in this. But it is something that's continuous that we need to keep involved with at every step of the way. So it starts with creating the right environment, create that reading culture in the classroom, get everyone buying into it, make it sort of a fun thing. I've never had a problem setting up book clubs and getting people invested in reading in my classes. Probably because I'm so passionate about it and don't give them a choice. But yes, so it's creating that safe environment where everyone feels comfortable reading. Then generating the initial, you know, reading motivation, triggering interest, you know, whether it is using the blurbs on the back, whether it is using like the first opening part of a chapter on the board, whatever it might be, whether it's an experiment you're getting them involved with that they then need to go and read about afterwards. Then we've got to maintain that interest and protect it. So, you know, a lot of collaborative activities, people talk about readers' theatre quite a lot, where they enact parts of the book or something. I've never done that myself, if I'm being honest, but a lot of people seem to enjoy that. But yes, and then the gold conferences, having that feedback, having those little moments with students. It could just be walking around them while they're doing something else in the classroom, just checking in. How does the reading going? How did you get on last night with it, or whatever it might be? And encouraging that retrospective evaluation, encouraging them to evaluate themselves, and then reset the goals if they need resetting, or choose different books. If the book's boring, they should be free to put it down and start a new one. Don't force them to keep reading a book if they don't like it. And then back to sort of, you know, the start of the cycle again. Keep that motivation there, keep it running, keep it flowing, and hopefully you'll have a cohort of happy readers. And that is the end of my talk.